December 17, 2025, the United States Senate Chamber. 77 senators vote yes, 20 vote no. And with that single roll call, $901 billion becomes the foundation of American military power for the next 12 months. This isn't just another budget. This is a strategic declaration, a message sent simultaneously to Moscow, Beijing, and every allied capital from Berlin to Tokyo. The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act has passed Congress, and buried inside its 1,000 pages of legislative text are decisions that will reshape battlefields, redraw alliance commitments, and redefine what American military presence means in an increasingly dangerous world. $800 million locked in for Ukraine. New restrictions preventing troop withdrawals from Europe without congressional approval. Enhanced cooperation frameworks with NATO and AUKUS partners. And billions allocated to technologies most people won't see for another decade. But here's what makes this different from every other defense bill in recent memory. This NDAA doesn't just fund the Pentagon, it challenges the executive branch's authority over where American troops are stationed. It embeds long-term commitments to allies into law, and it does something Washington rarely manages anymore. It passes with overwhelming bipartisan support in an era of deep political division. So what's actually inside this $900 billion package? Why are some calling it the most strategically significant defense bill since the Cold War? And what does it mean for the balance of power from the Baltic Sea to the South China Sea? This is the story of how a single piece of legislation became a weapon. $901 billion. Let that number settle for a moment. That's more than the entire GDP of Saudi Arabia, more than Switzerland spends in a year on everything. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure, everything. And the United States just authorized it for a single year of military operations. But raw spending numbers only tell part of the story. What matters is where that money flows and what strategic priorities it reveals. Start with Ukraine. $800 million through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, the Pentagon-managed program that funds contractors to deliver everything from ammunition to armored vehicles directly into Ukrainian hands. This isn't aid shipped from American stockpiles. This is fresh production, new contracts, weapons built specifically for the battlefield conditions Ukrainian forces face right now. And here's the critical detail most coverage misses. That funding is locked into the legislative text. It's not discretionary. It's not subject to presidential whim or shifting political winds. Congress has mandated this support by law. Any administration that wants to cut or redirect these funds would need to come back to Capitol Hill and explain why. Then, there's the Baltic Security Initiative, $175 million earmarked specifically for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the three NATO members that share direct borders with Russia, the frontline states that watch Russian military exercises just kilometers from their territory. This funding builds infrastructure, strengthens deterrence capabilities, and signals something absolutely critical to Moscow. The United States is not abandoning NATO's eastern flank, but it's the next provision that reveals the deepest strategic shift, language prohibiting reductions in U.S. troop levels in Europe below established thresholds without congressional review. Think about what that actually means. The executive branch no longer has unilateral authority to withdraw American forces from European soil. Congress has inserted itself directly into military posture decisions. This is unprecedented, and it's aimed at preventing exactly the kind of surprise troop drawdowns that have rattled European allies in previous administrations. Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states now have a legislative guarantee that American military presence won't vanish overnight. The Indo-Pacific gets its share too. Enhanced cooperation language with AUKUS partners, the Australia-UK-US Defense Pact, focused on containing Chinese expansion. Increased funding for Pacific deterrence operations. New authorities for joint training exercises and technology sharing with Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. What we're watching is the weaponization of budget legislation. Congress isn't just funding the military, it's using the power of the purse to lock in strategic commitments that outlast any single presidency. The road to this moment began on December 10th. The House of Representatives took up the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual ritual that's continued unbroken for 65 consecutive years. 312 members voted yes, 112 voted no. The bill moved to the Senate. December 16th. Senate floor debates began, and this is where it gets interesting, because the debates weren't about whether to fund defense. They weren't even primarily about the $900 billion price tag. The real battles were over Ukraine language, troop posture restrictions, and oversight provisions. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, stood on the Senate floor and made the case. This defense bill strengthens our alliance commitments in Europe, supports Ukraine's defense, and ensures cooperation with allied industrial partners. Translation: we're codifying support that some worry might disappear under different political leadership. Senator Jack Reed, the ranking member on armed services, echoed the theme. It bolsters America's posture toward China, reinforces support for NATO and Ukraine, and helps the United States adapt to evolving threats while maintaining strong oversight. That word, oversight, kept appearing because alongside all the spending, Congress inserted new reporting requirements. The Pentagon must now regularly brief Congress on force posture changes. Any significant operational shift requires documentation. Transparency mechanisms that didn't exist before are now embedded in law. December 17th, the final vote, 77-20. In today's hyper-partisan Washington, that kind of margin is almost unheard of. The bill goes to the president's desk for signature, a formality at this point. Once signed, it becomes law. But here's the twist no one expected. Throughout the legislative process, analysts noticed something unusual. The bill included provisions preventing not just reductions in European troop levels, but also requirements that any changes be coordinated with NATO allies. This isn't just about troop numbers, it's about ensuring that American military strategy in Europe runs through Brussels, not just Washington. Some see this as Congress protecting alliances, others see it as Congress tying the hands of future administrations. Either way, it's a fundamental shift in how the United States makes decisions about where its military operates. Let's talk about what $800 million actually buys on a modern battlefield. The Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative isn't charity. It's not aid in the traditional sense. It's a Pentagon-managed contracting program that turns American industrial capacity into Ukrainian battlefield capability. Here's how it works. Ukrainian military commanders identify capability gaps. They need artillery shells, anti-tank weapons, air defense systems, armored vehicles. That request goes to the Pentagon. The Pentagon doesn't ship these items from American stockpiles. Instead, it contracts American defense manufacturers to build them fresh. Those contracts go to companies across the United States. Assembly lines ramp up. Workers are hired, components are manufactured, and the finished weapon systems ship directly to Ukraine. The American defense industrial base expands. Ukrainian forces get exactly what they need for current battlefield conditions. And the whole process pumps money back into American manufacturing, but there's a deeper strategic calculation here. Every weapon system Ukraine receives comes with training, with maintenance support, with integration into NATO standard operating procedures. Ukraine's military is being transformed intentionally into a force that operates seamlessly with NATO equipment and tactics. This matters because conflicts end, wars conclude, and when this one does, Ukraine will have a military that's already integrated with Western systems. That's not an accident. That's strategic planning for whatever post-conflict security architecture emerges in Eastern Europe. And here's where the legislative lock-in becomes critical. Previous aid packages required annual appropriations fights. Every year, Congress had to vote new funding. Every year, there was uncertainty about whether support would continue. That uncertainty complicated long-term contracts, made planning difficult, and gave both Ukraine and Russia reasons to question American staying power. This NDAA changes that calculation. The $800 million is law. It's authorized. And any future administration that wants to change course faces a much higher bar. They have to go back to Congress and make the case for cutting support that's already been mandated. Moscow is watching this closely because what it signals is staying power. American support for Ukraine isn't dependent on a single administration's foreign policy preferences. It's been embedded into the legislative framework that governs Pentagon operations. Now shift your focus northeast to three small countries that loom far larger than their size in the strategic calculations of both NATO and Russia: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states. These nations share something that makes them uniquely vulnerable. They border Russia directly. They're former Soviet republics. They have significant Russian-speaking populations. And they've watched, with growing alarm, as Russian military doctrine has evolved to include scenarios for rapid, overwhelming conventional assault designed to present NATO with a fait accompli before the alliance can respond. The nightmare scenario keeps Baltic defense planners awake at night. Russian forces sweep across the border. They seize key territory in hours, not days, and they present NATO with a choice: accept the loss or risk escalation to counter an invasion of alliance territory. It's the ultimate test of Article 5, the collective defense provision that promises an attack on one is an attack on all. This is why the $175 million in Baltic Security Initiative funding matters so much. It's not about the money itself. Saudi Arabia could write that check without blinking. What matters is the signal it sends and the infrastructure it builds. That funding goes toward pre-positioned equipment stockpiles, ammunition depots, fuel reserves, command and control facilities, the logistics infrastructure that would allow NATO forces to flow into the region rapidly if conflict erupted. And perhaps most importantly, it funds persistent American military presence, rotational forces that ensure there are always U.S. troops on the ground. Those troops serve a specific strategic function. They're a tripwire. Their presence guarantees that any Russian military action in the Baltics immediately involves American forces. There's no scenario where Russia invades without U.S. personnel being in harm's way from the first moments. That dramatically raises the stakes and changes the calculus in Moscow. But there's something else happening here that deserves attention. NATO has quietly been building what some analysts call the Baltic Wall, a defensive line running through Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia China, designed to slow or stop any conventional Russian assault long enough for NATO reinforcements to arrive. The NDAA funding accelerates that construction. Tank barriers, artillery positions, reinforced border infrastructure, sensor networks, all the unglamorous logistics and engineering that modern defense requires. And here's where congressional restrictions on troop withdrawals connect directly to Baltic security. European allies have watched with concern as various U.S. administrations have floated ideas about reducing the American military footprint in Europe. Germany has worried about troop drawdowns. Poland has lobbied intensely to host more permanent American bases. This NDAA eliminates much of that uncertainty. The troops stay, the infrastructure gets built, and the message to Russia is unambiguous. NATO's eastern flank is not vulnerable. Any miscalculation about alliance resolve would be catastrophic. But while eyes focus on Europe, the most consequential long-term strategic shift embedded in this defense bill might be happening 8,000 miles away. In the waters of the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, in the expanding network of partnerships the United States is building to counter Chinese military expansion. The NDAA includes significant language strengthening three critical security frameworks. AUKUS, the trilateral pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States focused on advanced military technology and nuclear submarine cooperation. The Quad, the informal strategic dialogue between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. And bilateral security arrangements with Taiwan, the Philippines, and South Korea. Let's break down what that actually means in practice. AUKUS is about technology transfer at a level rarely seen between even close allies. Australia is acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, conventionally armed, but with the endurance and stealth that only nuclear propulsion provides. That capability transforms Australian naval power and extends the reach of allied forces across the Pacific. The United States and United Kingdom are sharing propulsion technology, weapon systems integration, and operational doctrine that took decades to develop. This isn't just selling equipment, it's creating interoperability at the deepest levels. Australian submarines will operate seamlessly alongside American and British vessels. Command structures are being integrated. Joint training exercises are becoming routine. And China is watching every single development. Because what AUKUS represents, what the entire Indo-Pacific security architecture represents, is containment. Not the Cold War-style ideological containment aimed at the Soviet Union. This is strategic containment aimed at preventing Chinese military domination of the Pacific and ensuring freedom of navigation through waters that carry trillions of dollars in trade every year. The Taiwan provisions are particularly sensitive. The NDAA includes language-enhancing military cooperation, expanding training opportunities, and accelerating weapons deliveries to Taiwanese forces. None of this violates the One China policy that's governed U.S.-China relations for decades, but it pushes right up against the boundaries of what Beijing considers acceptable. And that's precisely the point. The United States is signaling that while it maintains strategic ambiguity about whether it would defend Taiwan militarily, it's absolutely committed to ensuring Taiwan has the capability to defend itself. That's a distinction without a difference from Beijing's perspective, but it's a distinction Washington carefully maintains. The funding also accelerates Pacific Deterrence Initiative programs. Think of this as the Indo-Pacific equivalent of what the United States built in Europe during the Cold War. Pre-positioned equipment, enhanced logistics networks, expanded base access agreements with the Philippines, Japan, and Australia. The infrastructure that would allow American forces to operate at scale across the Pacific in a crisis. Here's where the situation escalates further, because China isn't standing still. Beijing has watched NATO expansion. It's observed the Baltic Security Initiative. It's taken note of the Ukraine aid packages, and it's drawn conclusions about what those patterns mean for any potential Taiwan scenario. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have intensified. Gray zone operations, activities below the threshold of armed conflict, but designed to test responses and normalize increased military presence, have become routine. And Chinese defense spending continues to climb at rates that concern Pentagon planners. This NDAA is America's answer, not with rhetoric, with resources, with legal commitments, with the slow, grinding work of building alliance structures that would make any Chinese military adventurism prohibitively costly. Now let's talk about the weapons systems and technologies that $900 billion is actually purchasing, because buried in the appropriations are investments in capabilities that will define warfare for the next generation. Hypersonic weapons development gets a massive funding boost. These are missiles that travel at 5 times the speed of sound, or faster, so fast that current air defense systems struggle to track them. let alone intercept them. China and Russia have already deployed hypersonic weapons. The United States is playing catch-up. This NDAA accelerates that timeline. Artificial intelligence integration across every domain, AI-powered targeting systems, autonomous drones that can identify and engage threats without human operators in the loop, predictive maintenance algorithms that keep aircraft and ships operational longer. The Pentagon is betting heavily that AI will provide the decisive edge in future conflicts. Space-based capabilities expansion, satellite constellations for communications and reconnaissance, anti-satellite weapons to deny adversaries their own space assets. The United States Space Force gets significant funding increases to counter what Pentagon planners see as growing threats from Chinese and Russian anti-satellite capabilities. Cyber warfare infrastructure, offensive cyber capabilities to disrupt enemy networks, defensive systems to protect American critical infrastructure. The acknowledgement that future conflicts will be fought as much in cyberspace as in physical domains. And then there are the programs we can't talk about in detail because they remain classified. Black budget allocations for development programs that won't be publicly acknowledged for years. The technologies that will surprise adversaries when they eventually deploy. So where does this leave us? The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act is now law. $901 billion authorized, strategic commitments locked in, congressional oversight expanded, and messages sent to allies and adversaries alike about American staying power and resolve. Ukraine gets certainty about continued support. The Baltic states get infrastructure and presence guarantees. Indo-Pacific partners get enhanced cooperation and capabilities. And the Pentagon gets the resources to continue modernizing for great power competition. But this isn't the end of the story. It's a chapter in a much longer narrative about how the United States positions itself in an increasingly multipolar world, where the unquestioned American military dominance of the post-Cold War era is being challenged. Russia is grinding forward in Ukraine despite massive losses. China continues military modernization at a pace that concerns every Pentagon strategist. Iran is expanding influence across the Middle East. North Korea is testing ever more capable missiles. The security challenges aren't diminishing. If anything, they're intensifying. And that raises uncomfortable questions about sustainability. Can the United States maintain $900 billion defense budgets indefinitely? What happens when other priorities compete for resources? How long can congressional consensus on these strategic commitments hold? The answers will unfold over the next year, the next administration, the next crisis. What we know right now is that America has made its choice. It's not retreating. It's not drawing down. It's doubling down on alliances, on forward presence, on technological superiority, and on the proposition that American military power, carefully applied and strategically positioned, remains essential to global stability. Whether that proposition holds depends on what happens next in Ukraine, in the Taiwan Strait, in the Baltic region, in countless places where great power competition plays out in real time. The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act passed the Senate with 77 votes, but its real test won't come in Congress. It will come on the ground in Estonia, in the skies over Taiwan, in the waters of the South China Sea, and in every place where the limits of American power and commitment are probed, tested, and challenged. This $900 billion bill is more than a budget. It's a strategy made law, a commitment made binding, and a signal to the world about what the United States is willing to defend. As the president signs it into law, militaries from Moscow to Beijing are already calculating what it means for their own plans. Allies are breathing slightly easier, and strategists are gaming out the scenarios where these commitments will face their ultimate test. Because in the end, defense bills aren't judged by the dollars they authorize. They're judged by whether the peace they're meant to secure actually holds. And that answer, we won't know for certain until the moment when deterrence either works or fails.